All right. Hi there, Econ 1A students. I thought today it'd be nice to go over a little bit of a review of the market aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We started talking about it in the last Zoom. We're going to spend some time next week talking about it. But I wanted to make sure that you guys had a good sense of it. This is a big model, it's a big deal, and it's weird, right? It's a little bit different from what we've looked at before, in part because we have two supply curves. So I'm going to go through and just kind of talk about it as I draw it for you guys, and then we'll talk about some of the factors that affect it. So the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, remember, is a model of the whole economy for a country. So we could think about the United States, right? We have the United States' whole economy. And so because it's the whole economy, it's going to be like the market forces of supply and demand model, in that it's going to be quantities and prices, but it's going to be different in that instead of looking at just the price and quantity of a single good, we're going to be looking at the price level for the entire economy, P, and we're going to use our measure of the quantity is going to be GDP, or our Y, right? And so remember we said that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, we're going to use that now to talk about our economy, right? To talk about, that's going to be the Y down here. We're also going to continue to reference our production function, which is that our output is a function of the technological progress, human capital, physical capital, natural resources, and labor force in a country. Those are both going to come into play in this model. So kind of keep those in mind. Those are not going away. The other thing that's not going away is the price level. We measure our price level using the CPI most frequently. And so that's also going to be in play here. A lot of the ideas we've used and thought about so far are coming into play now. So we've got our price level up here. I'm going to write that in for y'all. And we've got our Y, which is our measure of GDP. You kind of see that? Yeah, you can still sort of mostly see that. And the first thing we put in our model is our demand curve. And we're going to call it our aggregate demand because it's the aggregate demand of everything in our economy, everything added up, aggregated. And aggregate demand is based on all the goods that are included in this economy, right? So it's based on the consumption, investment spending, and net exports in our economy. We assume that government spending isn't going to respond to the price level, so it's not going to play a role in it. But CI and NX are all going to be, inversely related. Make sure you can still see me there. Hold on. Oops. Inversely related to that price level. And some of that stuff we have a sense of. So there's the idea that there is the wealth effect, that as prices go up, people are going to feel poorer and buy less stuff. If prices were to go down, you'd feel richer and buy more stuff. For example, price of gas went down. That's just one good, but when the price of gas went down, I don't know about y'all, but I felt very wealthy and I was very excited to buy more things. So the price level is going to affect people's consumption. We talked a little bit about the interest rate effect and the exchange rate effect, and basically that's the same relationship. We're going to see the increase in the price level decrease investment spending and decrease net exports. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about why. That's the chapters that we kind of skipped, looking at the open economy macro, looking at the market for loanable funds. But the general idea there is that as the price level rises, we're going to see interest rates rise. Interest rates are going to make borrowing more expensive, reducing investment spending, and it's going to make U.S. bonds look more attractive, which is going to increase the demand for dollars, appreciating the exchange rate. If the U.S. dollar gets more expensive relative to other currencies, then our exports are going to fall and our imports are going to drop. And so we're going to see net exports also be inversely related. So the idea there is that of those elements, let's do it this way, of those elements of GDP, right? Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. If the price level goes up, That's going to decrease consumption spending, decrease investment spending, and decrease net exports. And so we have a negatively sloped aggregate demand curve for that reason. Okay? The other thing we want to think about is the fact that we can see the aggregate demand curve shift if we see anything that changes any of these elements. So if we see, say, if we take out this change in price level, anything that's not a change in price but does affect these elements, that's going to shift the demand curve. So, for example, right now we're in a position where we're seeing fewer people buy consumer goods, right? People aren't going to work, they're buying less gas, maybe they've lost jobs and so they have less income. So we're seeing a decrease in consumption because of coronavirus. That's going to shift aggregate demand into a lower level because we're seeing less economic activity, fewer goods being bought and sold as a result of that, decrease in demand. We could also think about how there's a decrease in net exports. People are buying fewer US goods. That's going to also affect aggregate demand. Maybe decreased investment spending. That's going to affect aggregate demand. So all of those things play a role in aggregate demand. Okay, so anything that affects any of these elements. The other thing we could think about is let's switch it up a little bit and think about government spending. Let's say the US government decides that the way to solve the current crisis is they are going to build a bunch of new schools. That would be an increase in government spending as the US government buys land and equipment and materials to build all those new schools. An increase in G is going to shift aggregate demand out to a higher level. Does that make sense? So basically, when we're talking about aggregate demand, we're talking about the relationship between the price level and GDP. And so C, I, G, and NX are going to affect and shift GDP. Okay? They're going to shift that aggregate demand curve. So that's part of the model. The next part of the model is supply. And this is the tricky part, right? Because aggregate supply is going to be two things. It's going to be upward sloping in the short run, and it's going to be vertical in the long run. So long run aggregate supply is going to be vertical in the long run because of a couple of things. One is that there is this idea of a natural rate of unemployment, or a natural rate of unemployment and a natural rate of productivity. We can consider that YN. And that comes from the ideas that we've talked about already, right? The idea that there is a natural rate of unemployment, the idea that our productivity Y is not dependent on the price level, it's dependent on our production function, right? HKLN. So only these things can shift long-run aggregate supply. So as prices go up and down, let's say this is P2, this is P1, we're not going to see that have an effect on long-run aggregate supply. And that's because of the classical dichotomy, the monetary neutrality that we talked about in the monetary theory chapter, right? This idea that changes in the price level aren't going to affect real GDP. Does that make sense? Hopefully you remember that a little bit. So that's where our long-run aggregate demand is going to come from. What would affect long-run aggregate supply would be a change in one of these things. So if we saw, say, let's say from the example I was just saying, the government decides that they want to build a bunch of new schools to help grow the economy, that's going to have the effect of increasing human capital. That would shift long-run aggregate supply out, increasing the natural rate of productivity and the natural rate of unemployment to a higher level. That pen is almost dead. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully. Anything that shifts, basically a long-run major change in our natural resources, our human capital, our physical capital or our labor force is going to have the ability to shift long run aggregate supply. One thing that people have talked about is, well, in the book, we talk about the idea of how computers have shifted long run aggregate supply. So that's a change in technology, right? Having computers get better and better over the years has meant that we've seen massive changes in technological advances, and that's made all of our inputs more efficient, shifting long run aggregate supply out. One thing we could think of, I was talking with some other economists, people talk about, oh, well, everyone's huddled up in their houses. Maybe there's going to be a whole baby boom associated with people being stuck at home. The other thing I was thinking is, well, yeah, people are stuck at home, but people are also dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and that could have a negative effect on birth rates. So let's say we see that people are stuck at home and they're worried about the future, and so we see a decrease in birth rates. That's going to be have an effect on L, right? It's going to decrease our labor force. So if we see birth rates drop, and we talked about this a little bit in class, actually, the idea that we do see birth rates falling. If birth rates fall, there could be the effect of fewer workers. Fewer workers might shrink our economy down to a lower natural level of output. And the big idea here is that our economy has a natural level of output, a level at which it's just producing, it's churning along, it's producing what it should, and those short-run fluctuations might occur. That business cycle that we talked about, remember we said that there's this business cycle, and so over time, we're going to see, let's see, if we look at GDP over time, there might be increases and decreases, but overall, we're going to see a overall trend of growth. That's what this is, right? We're talking about YN is going to be that overall trend, that resting point, and then we are going to see fluctuations around that, though, and those fluctuations take place in that upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's walk through what that looks like. Okay, let's get all this up again, nice and clean, so it makes sense. So, I don't want that pen. I've become a lot pickier about my pens now that they just show up on a screen. So we've got our price level, we've got our GDP, and we've got our long run and short run aggregate supply curve. And so here's our downward sloping aggregate demand. And here's our long run aggregate supply. And then short run aggregate supply is going to be upward sloping. And why short run aggregate supply is upward sloping is going to be a couple of different things. So the reason we're going to see short run aggregate supply be upward sloping is basically because of some lag in adjustment. And when we go through the slides, and we talk about it in Zoom, if you go through those slides for week 13, chapter 15, what you'll see is we have different theories. We have the sticky wage theory, the sticky price theory, and the misperceptions theory. But they all have the same thing in common. It's all the idea that in the short run, we might misunderstand or not adjust correctly to a change in the price level. So at the very beginning, we've talked about a lot how changes in the price level aren't going to have an effect on real variables like the natural rate of GDP. But in the short run, there can be an effect. There can be a maybe wages don't adjust right away, or prices don't adjust right away, or there's some misperception about the price level. And so what that means is if the price level changes, if we have some effect, some shift in aggregate demand, that's going to have an effect in the short run on aggregate supply and as we adjust. So if we have, let's say we have a period of economic expansion because of the government. One of the things we're doing as part of trying to solve this problem with the coronavirus outbreak is we are increasing funding for businesses, right? The government has all these plans to try and help businesses. And so what we're seeing is, let me find a good pen to draw this with. Looks like it's going to be pink. So we're seeing an increase. Nope, that's not going to work. All right, we'll do it red. Let's say the government tries to incentivize investment spending. That's going to have the effect of increasing output. That's going to shift aggregate demand out. So in the short run, that is going to have an effect on GDP because of one of these three theories, because of sticky wages, because of sticky prices, or because of misperception. So when we see that happen, we're going to see GDP temporarily, basically we're going to see, we're going to move from, let's see, this first initial point here, all up to this new point on the short run aggregate supply curve, where we're going to be at a higher than usual, let's call it Y high, level of aggregate demand. So GDP is higher than the natural rate. We'd have unemployment be lower than the natural rate because the economy is doing like gangbusters. It's going to be a period of economic expansion. If you think about that business cycle, it's going to be one of these up peaks, right? And we're going to be up here at this new higher price level. Now, what happens eventually, though, is the economy will return to this natural rate of unemployment, this natural rate of output. And that's going to happen along the new aggregate demand curve. And really what happens is the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift back over and over again until we get to a new equilibrium right here at an even higher price level. So that's kind of a lot. If you go through the slides, you'll see that worked out and explained a little bit, but I wanted to walk through it with you a little bit now just to give you a sense of it. We're going to keep talking about this through the next few days, to the next few Zoom sessions. I'll ask you guys some questions about it on Canvas. But the big idea here is that aggregate demand and aggregate supply in equilibrium are going to be at this natural rate of output. Long run aggregate supply will only shift if it's something that changes the production function. Aggregate demand will only shift if it's something that changes that Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And then short run aggregate supply is an adjustment mechanism. It's the way that the economy moves from that natural rate to some high or low level and then adjusts back. And those movements through those high and low levels are these periods of economic expansion and economic contraction as part of the business cycle. And that happens because the expected price level is different from the actual price level, and it takes our economy time to adjust to that reality. So I just wanted to give you guys a sense of that model, talk it through a little bit. Go ahead and pop on Canvas and look at the discussion page, the discussion thread. Let me know what questions you have. Take a look at the slides, take a look at the textbook, and we will talk about it in the next Zoom meeting. If you have any questions, if there's anything you want me to go over, if there's anything you want me to explain, let me know, and we will talk about it together in class. There is, if you look at the slides, on slides 53 and 54, the book walks you through an example. And the nice thing is those slides are animated, so you can kind of see the step-by-step, which is cool. If that doesn't work for you, let me know. Ask me questions, hit up the discussion board, hit up the Zoom meetings, hit up my email, and I will see you guys next time.